Hello, my name is Joy Badawell and welcome once again to Truth Unraveled. The last time we left off at looking at the maps and we were looking at the eastern half of the Roman Empire, but I had to stop, and what I'm doing today is actually a recapping, and therefore this would be part B. That would be 1B of identifying the woman of Revelation 17, because I think there were some pointers that I did not made very clear. So what I decided to do was just do that today. So with that in mind, let us have a word of prayer. My Father and my Lord, today we come once again to your study, and as we approach the study about the mystery of this woman, we know in you, Lord, all mysteries are unsealed, because you're the God who gives enlightenment, and you're the revealer of all secrets. So we thank you now, and we ask that you'll help us to apply your truths to our lives, that we may truly live as you want us to live, in your will, as we give you thanks in your holy and precious name. Amen. Now, as usual, I do a quick recap, so I'll just tell you what I've done so far. We have looked at Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, which I told you that's the most important set of verses to understand in order to understand Revelation 17. And in fact, that includes verse 7 and 8, but that will have to be a different segment. Now, we also, next I took you to Revelation 17, verse 1, where we saw that the angel spoke of the punishment of a woman, a harlot, who is sitting by the abundant waters or many waters. And I've shown you the word enthroned. That means she's a queen. And I've also shown you that we'll have to go into the book of Jeremiah to understand that verse. Next, I had gone to Jeremiah 25, which I had not put up, but I had related back verse 11 down to 14, where we saw about the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And because it was important to understand that, in order to understand the verse that we wanted to get to, that is Jeremiah 51 verse 13, which speaks of Babylon as dwelling by many waters, which would have been the parallel to what we've just read in Revelation 17:1. When we had gotten to Jeremiah 51, there was verse 5 says that the Lord has not forsaken Israel and Judah. Now, why did he say that? That's because Israel, that's the 10 tribes, that's a northern tribe, was taken into captivity by the Assyrian king, and of course he had completely replaced them with Babylonians, Avites, Hamathites, and so on. And these people are those people that we saw. Their lineage started back from Ham down through Nimrod through the line of Cush. Now, what we find is that, well, I did show you in a previous study where Abraham was given the first covenant that God made with him. That's in Genesis 15. God promised him those lands of these people. And this is what is causing all this conflict. However, when they had sinned, that is, Israel had sinned, God threw them out of the land with the Assyrians completely gone, so they are dispersed, and just a handful, Deuteronomy 4 told us, that is left in the land. And then Judah was left in the land, two tribes. Now they continued to sin, and God now sent Babylon, but God is saying, look, I have not forsaken them. Now, this is something that people need to remember. You find that there sometimes churches say God is through with Israel, and that's not true. When I said Israel, basically what God is focusing on is Judah, the line of Judah. Now, the other thing is this, that statement will also help us to understand Revelation 17, because when we're reading about Revelation 17, as I'm going to show, it's really Jerusalem he's talking about. When we read the studies that I'm going to go into today, we're going to see that God made a promise that he's going to restore them. And that is why when you get to Revelation 17:16, you're going to hear that this scarlet beast and the 10 horns that this woman is riding on hates the woman. Now, let me stop there. I'm not going to go through that, but at this point, but there's another point that you need to remember. I showed you that the verse 6 in here in Jeremiah 51 is related. I did not tell you the address, but it's related to Revelation 18:4, where God says, look, flee. The same thing he's saying, flee from this. Do not partake of their sins. Why is that statement there? Because God is still talking about sin and its relationship to, because the temple must be holy. So he's saying, look, whatever is happening, his people have taken on the atrocities of the nations, the Gentile nations, because what had happened, God had separated Israel as his people, totally separated, a people called for himself. And when they got entangled with all these nations and adopt their customs, that's what God says is harlotry to him. Now, if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand Revelation 17 and 18. Neither will you understand Revelation at all. Another thing too you'll have to understand is that when God separated them to himself as his people, he made a covenant, and that covenant was a marriage covenant. And I asked the question in the previous study, how can we say therefore that this is Rome? It is not, because Rome could not be the one, because God did not make a covenant, a marriage covenant with Rome. A harlot is one who was married. As far as God's concerned, he says, I married you, Jerusalem. I married you. And you went off, you adopt these principles of all these other nations, and you started to worship their gods. So this is what happens. He said that's adultery to him. So if you don't understand that principle, then you're really not going to understand Revelation. Okay? I had left out in the verse part B of verse 11 where God had said what he's doing to Babylon, bringing the Medes against Babylon, which we're going to see that also in the book of Daniel. It says that this is his vengeance on those who wronged his people and desecrated his temple. So we also looked at the fact that verse 13 says, O you who dwell by many waters, which would be the link, the direct link with Revelation 17 verse 1, the parallel. But what I said to you is that though this is true, that Babylon is mentioned here as the place that dwell by many waters, when we get to Revelation 17 and it speaks of Babylon the harlot, though what we have to always bear in mind is that God is not just simply saying Babylon, he's saying mystery and then Babylon. So there's a mystery to it, and I told you it's really Jerusalem he's talking about. So in order to understand it, I showed you that we had to look at the whole thing of where Babylon was, where Rome was, because Rome came up in the whole study, and understand where Jerusalem was. And I took you to the maps. So this is what we're going to be looking at now. Now in the last study, after looking at Revelation 17:1, and we saw the parallel that I've just read here in Jeremiah 51 verse 13, it seems as if, well, that's crystal clear. Babylon is sitting by many waters, and then when we get down to Revelation 17:9, we read about the woman sitting or residing on these 7 hills. Now let us look at it, because that is what everyone now reads that and say, okay, so that's Rome. Babylon really represents Rome. But the question still has not been answered. Who is the woman? So that's what we're going to clarify. So let's look at it again. Place verse 3 beside verse 9 to let you see something. Let us read. So the angel took me in the spirit into the wilderness. Now, why did the Spirit take John into the wilderness? Now, what you have to recognize here is that whenever you're reading about the wilderness, you must think biblical. Every time you read about wilderness, God is speaking about when he took the children of Israel through the wilderness. So this is not Rome. That's the first number one point you have to nail down. And that's because he was taking her out of Egypt, and then you saw that he took her to Canaan. Then she sinned. She wasn't living in the promised land as she should, and because of that, the original Babylon came and did what they had to do, as we saw. I won't go into all of that. Now look at verse 9, and now think hard. His 7 heads represent a certain city built on 7 hills where this woman has her residence. Remember, it says the scarlet animal. Now, the word scarlet means red, and it speaks about having 7 heads and 10 horns. When you get back to Revelation 12, we see that scarlet beast is actually the red dragon, which is called the Satan and the devil. And he had 7 heads and 10 horns. So, with that, it is saying, therefore, this woman is sitting at this place, and the horns of that beast, which is Satan, is built on 7 hills. Now, everyone understand that 7 hills is Rome. But notice what it continues says, where this woman has her residence, or where she dwells. Now, that is saying she is living within the precincts of Rome. Now, let us go on further. Revelation 17:1 had told us that she sits on many waters. That's where the harlot sits. And then verse 9, as I've just showed you, said that's where her residence is, and it explains that this is where there are 7 hills, and of course that is Rome. So we looked at it also. I also pointed out the parallel between verse 1 of Revelation 17 and Revelation 21:9, and we saw that in both cases there's this angel who points out and keeps saying, come, I will show you. But in one she was saying, I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot, and then in Revelation 21 verse 9 she says, come, I'll show you the bride of the Lamb's wife. That is because God is consistently keeping in mind the temple. The Lamb is about what is slain in the temple, and of course we know that's Yeshua, which is otherwise known as Jesus. So now let us move on to the other verse. Now, I told you, in order to understand the residence which is within the precincts of Rome, which is 7 hills, and the many waters, which is speaking of Babylon, which therefore what you're seeing here is Roman Babylon, and therefore it is as if saying, therefore Rome is the what would I say now? The extension of Babylon, and that is true. However, the fact that it's speaking of the temple, and we're going to look at it, we're going to see something here. What I pointed out to you is that we had to go back to Revelation 1 verse 4, where we saw that John opening, speaking of where the churches are, it says it's in Asia. And then I went over to show you some maps, and I showed you that's really Asia Minor, and I'm going to show you the link between all these places so you can understand the waters where the woman is sitting and her residence that is in Rome. And you'll understand by looking at that map, and as you go through the rest of the scripture that I'm going to take, you'll see that the woman is really Jerusalem. Now let's go there. I showed you that map, which is the eastern half of the Roman Empire, because it's within that precinct that you're going to find Jerusalem. So I had clipped the parts to make it more visible, and this is what we have found. I told you that the glue between all these places, Rome, Babylon, Jerusalem, is the Mediterranean Sea, the Great Mediterranean Sea. The Bible calls it the Great Sea, and some versions literally says the Mediterranean Sea, and it has a lot to say about the sea in the Bible. The reason for it is because this sea is going to link us with what is spoken of, that's called the Gihon Spring. That's where the temple, the site on which the temple is laid. And that Gihon Spring, which I'm going to bring you to that teaching at a later study, is going to relate us back to the temple in heaven. It's going to, as I'm going to show you the link throughout the scripture to show you that. Now, I had already given you a little background of the Mediterranean Sea in the previous study, and I showed you that here we had Babylon way down at the bottom there, and to your right you had Jerusalem, just by where you see that word Joppa and Caesarea and Tyrus, and then way up the top you see the Euphrates. Now, many times you find in the Bible the Euphrates is mentioned, and it's like a borderline, and it's also mentioned alongside with the Mediterranean Sea many times in the Bible as well, and it is called the Great Sea in the Bible. Some versions actually use the word Mediterranean. Now, what you find is that this was a place, when you read Genesis 15, when God made the covenant with Abraham, notice what God said in Genesis 15:18. On the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." So notice, here we have the Euphrates, not just called Euphrates, it's a great river Euphrates, and then we have the great Mediterranean Sea. Now, look at the other side of the pane. The Bible says verse 19, but it's actually 19 to 21 because of all the different names. It says, "And I give to them these nations, Kenites, Kenizzites, and so on." And we saw the Canaanites mentioned as well as the Girgahites and the Jebusites. And I took you back into Genesis 10 to show you side by side in a previous study that these were the descendants of Ham that came down through Cush and came through Nimrod. Now, so, and that, remember, Nimrod possessed Babylon. So that's what we're having here. That's a conflict. They were not willing to give up the land, though God gave it to them, and it would have remained with the people of God. But because the people of God sinned, followed the customs of these other nations, which of course these other nations were these very nations that God said he was going to drive out of the land. And so we have this. Now you have all these people sitting on the same site with the Mediterranean Sea in the middle, but that Euphrates, that great river Euphrates, is up the top, where you're going to have all that conflict in the end of the age. Now, let us look at what God had to say about Babylon as it relates to the Euphrates right here in Jeremiah 51 verse 63 to 64, because remember, verse 13 just told us that is the body of the great waters that Babylon is. So therefore, in essence, the great waters that it is referring to is really the Mediterranean Sea. And all these lands, both Babylon and Jerusalem and Rome, are all sitting near this Mediterranean Sea. That's the body of waters that Revelation 17 was talking about, and that's the body of water that Jeremiah 51 verse 13 had referred to, speaking of Babylon itself. Now let us look at further what Jeremiah 51 verse 63 to 64 has to say about Babylon as it relates to this Euphrates River. Actually, I'm just going to lift out verse 58 and then I'll jump down to 63. You can read in between. It says, "For the wide walls of Babylon shall be leveled to the ground, and her high gates shall be burned. The builders from many lands have worked in vain. Their work shall be destroyed by fire." What I want you to notice here, if you have been paying attention to the study so far, you'll recognize these were the very things Babylon did to Jerusalem. Babylon leveled the walls of Jerusalem. The gates were burned, and when you get to Nehemiah was trying to rebuild those walls and gates, and the place was just destroyed by fire, and the temple and everything. So here now God is giving the exact thing back to Babylon. That's what you call retribution. Now it went on, verse 59, during the fourth, before I read verse 59, I just use the word retribution. It's all over in the Bible, but the way in which I'd prefer to explain it is called the law of harvesting. Whatever you sow, you reap. And when you reap more than what you sow, because when you sow one grain of corn, you're going to get a whole field of corn. And this is what is happening to Babylon. Now, it says in verse 59 that it was during the reign of Zedekiah. Now, Zedekiah was the king of Judah, and this was the second siege of Babylon that this prophecy was given, and there are 3 sieges before Judah actually fell completely. So we're going to just drop down now to verse 60. Jeremiah wrote on a scroll all the terrible things God had scheduled against Babylon, all the words written above, and gave the scroll to Serah and said to him, "When you get to Babylon, read what I have written and say, Lord, you have said that you will destroy Babylon so that not a living creature will remain, and it will be abandoned forever." Notice that verse I want you to focus on is verse 63 to 64. 63, then when you have finished reading the scroll, tie a rock to it and throw it into the Euphrates River, and say, so shall Babylon sink, never more to rise, because of the evil I am bringing upon her. Now, as I have forged through the study, I have discovered that the Euphrates is directly linked to this place called the Plain of Dura. That is where Nebuchadnezzar had set up the statue in Babylon. That's in Daniel chapter 3 verse 1. But you'll have to remember that when you go back to Genesis chapter 10, just before you read about Nimrod, you read that the people were moving eastward and they came to this plain called Dura, and they stopped there, and that's where they decided to set up the tower Babel. So what you're seeing is that Babel is intricately related to the statue of Babylon, or the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, and it has a direct link, as I've said, with the Euphrates. That's why God is going to sink it, because that statue has everything to help you to understand the book of Revelation. So with that, now at this point I'm going to break, and I'll pick up into part 2, and I'll explain further about the Euphrates at that point. Thank you for listening, and may God richly bless you.